My name's Randy Swain, and as many of you have seen before, I'm a Marshall Goldsmith certified executive coach, and I'm also the founder of Coaching for Relevance, and actually a founding fellowship partner with the Institute for Organizational Neuroscience. And much of my career has been in aviation. Much of it's been military, and about the last 23 years has been in developing and training and certifying jet pilots. And my guest today is somebody who has had a similar journey for the last number of years. And just to let you know, I totally welcome a friend and colleague, Jim Bloomberg. And I want to just kind of welcome him. And I'd like to let him take a minute and take a couple of minutes and just introduce himself to you. A little bit of his background, kind of where he's from, and all that, and then we'll continue on. Jim, welcome, man.
Good morning, Randy, and it's a pleasure to be part of this organization today.
Well, thank you.
My background: I grew up in aviation. My father was a career military pilot, career airline pilot.
Ooh,
Uh, Learned to fly in high school, but wasn't very focused. Kind of grew up a little bit in my mid 20s. I kind of decided to pick myself back up and move forward. And over a 30-year association with Randy in different aspects of aviation, I grew in my career. I flew corporate, flew airlines, flew charter. Spent 15 years in the training business, then decided to leave and go fly for the airlines. And in the process of that, I witnessed some awesome people, but I also often wondered, well, why aren't these people moving forward? And it wasn't until 5 years ago that I was diagnosed with a life-threatening cancer, and that kind of puts your life on hold. The brakes come to a stop. But as I got through treatments, I realized I had dead time on my hands.
mm,
So I started taking several online courses through a national volunteer organization I belong to in leadership and not just the personal level, but the organizational and strategic.
wow, cool.
And in that process, I learned some things that great corporations that want to succeed apply. And I asked myself, well, why isn't Jim Bloomberg, uh, integrating those very same facets and tactics and being successful himself? So it's been a very interesting journey, and I look forward to sharing it with you today. So let's have a great day. Let's talk away.
Cool. Well, I tell you what, Jim, it's an honor to have you here, and much of what you just said is very aligned with my organizational maneuverability concept of, leading flight crews, but also leading business teams in a changing, unpredictable environment. And there's a lot of that going on, as you know. So you have my compliments on that. Let me ask you this, because it sounds like with some of the things that you just said, it sounds like there were some very memorable experiences in your life. One of the things that I kind of you know found interesting with what you just said is, when you were a youth, you sort of pulled yourself together and moved on in to your dream and everything. And you know what? That was very similar with my background as well at the, as a youth. But let me ask you this: as you think back on your journey up to this point, there may be one or two. Sounds like there may be three or something. There has been with me. But if you think about it, tell me about a key memorable experience that that you had that maybe might have been a defining moment in your life. Who knows?
Ironically, yes. I'll explain my journey. In 1990, I left the U.S. military. At probably one of the worst times to leave the military and come back to the civilian world. Our
Hmm.
economy was bad. Our industry was bad.
Hmm.
And I literally walked out of the Air Force with a private pilot's license, no money in my pocket, and decided, well, I can do this. And there's an old saying about airplanes. There's four forces of flight to make an airplane fly, but the
Yeah.
reality is the one force of flight makes an airplane. All four of those happen as money.
Yeah.
And
There's
so
some truth to that. Yeah.
I worked multiple jobs and did things, but ironically, you yourself, Randy Swain, kind of once they said to me, said, Jim, if you want to go be successful in something, you have to go underground and make it happen. And
Thank you.
what I achieved out of that was I looked at my friends. They were fresh out of college, fresh out of grad school. They were dating, they were doing things. And they're like, well, what are you doing with yourself?
Hmm.
I explained my goal was to eventually jet airplanes.
Yeah.
And they looked at me and they laughed and they said, well, you fly a Cessna 150. How are you going to go from that to a large jet?
Yeah.
And so I said, you know what? Fine. I need to surround myself with people that believe in me and believe in my vision. And so I literally went underground. I worked 3 jobs, worked overtime every chance I got, piled up a bunch of money, would go to training. So yes, my career was a little bit more drawn out, going through the pipeline of
Mhm.
certification. But
Mhm.
as I moved through there, what I realized of that underground commitment was people recognize and they support commitment. And
Mm.
they look at it and they go, wow, okay, here's a guy that doesn't have nothing, but he's working hard. He's done this, he's done this. I need to push something his direction.
Mm.
So I was involved in the national volunteer organization that's involved
Yeah.
in aviation,
Yeah.
and opportunities happened because of commitment. But what I didn't realize at that time is I was doing everything on the side in that organization so I could get more flight time. What I didn't realize is that was creating my relevancy as a person. That
Wow.
was showing that I could do more than just a job.
Mm.
And the next big, milestone achievement for me was in 2003. I became type rated in my first business jet,
Mhm.
and it forced me to really stop back and say, "Hey, 13 years ago you didn't have anything.
Mhm.
Now you're an airline transport pilot, which for folks not in our industry is a doctorate in
Yeah. There
aviation,
you go. Yeah.
and I was rated in a business jet,
Mhm.
in a 8-passenger business jet. I thought, wow,
Yeah.
I've come a long way. And interestingly, people who saw me come a long way, in fact, a very good mentor of mine, Michael Sigmund,
Mhm.
uh, recently retired airline captain, wrote me a letter about my first type rating and how to conduct myself. And ironically, every time I took a type ride, I would always pull that letter out and read it.
Oh.
And just recently, I completed my 8th type rating in the Airbus A320 airline.
I saw the post on that. So yeah, you definitely have my compliments on that. Keep
And
going. Sorry.
so those things are crowning moments.
Mhm.
But as I mentioned earlier, I had cancer.
Yeah.
And pre-pandemic, I was an airline pilot in 2017,
Mhm.
and I saw some phenomenal pilots that could never move from the regional jets that were flying onto legacy operations, cargo, things like that.
Yeah.
And they just weren't moving forward. But yet, and these were phenomenal pilots, great people to work with, leaders in their own right, but they just didn't have that extra oomph of innovation
Mhm.
and relevancy.
Yeah.
And what I saw was people that were involved in recruiting, involved in our training departments, involved in our pilot unions. They were increasing the relevancy because they were
Mhm.
showing innovation to do other things.
Mhm.
And so while I was out fighting with this cancer through a national volunteer organization I belonged to, I took several of their strategic leadership courses.
Wow.
And it was really interesting because in the economic time we live in right now, volunteer organizations and charities are having to redo the way they do business. Some of them
Organizational maneuverability for sure.
exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so they've had to say, okay, this process that got us here in 1950 is not necessarily working for us today. And we have competition
Mhm.
for the American citizen.
Yeah.
And let's face it, when people look to volunteer their time and give their time, they look at organizations that are relevant, innovative, and doing forward things that they can see themselves being a part of. That being said, I looked at myself and said, okay, Jim Bloomberg, what are you doing? How are
Mhm.
you making yourself relevant? How are you making yourself innovative? And I
Yeah.
was blessed to be rehired by a large international global training organization as an instructor pilot.
Mhm.
I came back. I left. Was unhappy when I left it 7 years before, but when
Mhm.
I came back, I really thrived. I really
Mhm.
picked up. I really brought things to the table that I hadn't brought as an airline pilot,
And
living up and down the East Coast.
I
And
can vouch for that because you and I have worked together in different programs, but for that organization for a number of years
right,
now. And so I've
and
seen some of that. Yeah.
all of those things realized to me, okay, Jim, strategically, the organization you're part of is trying to make itself innovative. It's trying to make itself relevant with the global environments today. What tactically is Jim Bloomberg doing to make Jim Bloomberg relevant?
Mhm.
And I realized, okay, yes, I fought a very life-threatening cancer for 3 years,
Mhm.
and I'm now standing here talking to
I
you.
remember that. Yeah.
And I looked at this and I said, okay, you're teaching simulator, you're a ground school instructor, you're a flight examiner. What are you doing to move to that next curve?
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, talking to friends in other industries, particularly in the medical industry, medical practices thrive and grow by their own innovativeness, innovative behavior,
Mm-hmm.
their own overhauling their processes to improve what they do for their patients, but their
Yeah.
employees. So I said, okay, you know what, Jim, it's time for you to make the leap.
Mm.
And so just recently, as of last week, in fact, I finished a Airbus A320 course, and I learned a lot of things out of that. Not only about just different technologies, different processes, but myself.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
it's very easy to get comfortable being who you are, and not,
Oh, wow. You talk about
and
something that is common in our society today.
not looking forward to the direction of what can you do to continue building your relevancy, so you can continue to grow.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that in my martial arts dojo, one of our, I think you've heard me say this before, but one of our central themes was as soon as you think you've arrived, it's solid proof that you have not. And you know what?
Exactly.
Exactly what you're saying. And that's true. Let me ask you this, because you were talking about it, how the reaction of people, and this is very aligned with part of my journey as well. And one of the things that they were sort of looking at is me becoming a TED Talk speaker, perhaps. That's this is going to be one aspect of that I do it. But when you talked about people responding to you differently and clicking in to kind of where you were going and believing in you, what made that difference in them?
Well, I think it made that difference in them because they saw somebody coming up to the ranks. Somebody was humble about it. Somebody that was more, it was that had the potential to be a we person.
Yeah.
I can tell you, and ironically, I had been in leadership roles prior to cancer
Mm-hmm.
and prior to being an airline pilot,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't until I was going through my cancer treatment that a physician's assistant said, "You do not have an eye disease. You have a we disease."
Interesting.
And it was real interesting because here I'm fighting a very life threatening illness,
Mm-hmm.
and there were days that I couldn't get up and go do what I had to do, and I just had to drag myself out of bed. And
Mm-hmm.
I realized that I was showing that I could be a we person. And I went through a very brutal 3 week operation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that happened in that 3 week operation was a lot of time stranded in a hospital bed. But at
Yeah.
all hours of the day and night, you would get drug out of bed to walk around the ward with a
Mm-hmm.
technician. And for probably the first week, I couldn't walk. I was on a walker. I
Yeah.
was having to be held up by technicians,
Mm-hmm.
and they would want 2 trips around the ward. But then one day I realized I started getting feeling back, and I said, you know what? I need to do 3 trips around the ward and
Okay.
show that I'm trying to move forward. So I started doing 3 trips around the ward. Ironically, with my pulmonary exercises, after the pulmonary therapy, with the therapist would leave, I'd wait about 5 minutes, and
Yeah.
I would blow the ball up in the tube, and it kind
Yeah.
of reminded me of the movie The Right Stuff with
Yeah.
Jonathan and Scott Carpenter
Yep.
in the competition. Well,
Yep.
I moved the lines up just a little
There
bit.
you go.
And
There
I'd
you
help
go.
my breath, and I get the ball up there, and I'd count. I do the count, and I get it. Well, what I didn't realize, and it wasn't until one of my middle of the night visits from a doctor or a nurse,
Mhm.
the resident surgeon for the ward came in to see me at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
The rest of the world would say, "Well, why would he come see you at 5 o'clock in the morning?" Well, I can assure you, in a hospital, no one sleeps.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so he said, "I got to tell you, Jim," he says, "you have proven something to us. You have shown a level of commitment that's hard to believe. We've watched you, and everybody else is status quo. They do their 3 laps. You've kind of built up. You do 5 laps every time we drag you around,
Mhm.
and you've gotten to a point that when you're in a hospital, you get a yellow gown. Means you have to be
Yeah.
escorted everywhere you need adult supervision."
Yeah.
Uh, he says, "Here's your lime green gown, but I'm going to tell you right now, don't get comfortable with it." And I said, "Why?" He says, "We're going to let you go home early." And so I realized that was leadership. And I
Mhm.
realized that was being a we person instead of an I person. And in the beginning of my treatments, I'd come into treatments, I'd do my thing, I'd go home.
Yeah.
When I had
Yeah.
kind of a minor relapse that I had to go back into chemotherapy,
Mhm.
I started realizing that life is not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Mhm.
And what you have to say to yourself is, okay, am I going to cry? Am I going to survive this thing and get to the other end? And am I going to have a team of people, not just cheerleaders on the sideline, but fellow runners
Mhm.
to help me put that?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in the past, I would come in, I'd do my treatments, I'd go home.
Mhm.
I made it a point to start getting to know my fellow patients. I made it a point to get to know the nurses. And I made and in the process of all of that, I informally on my own emerged as a leader in a cancer clinic.
It's interesting that you say that because one of the, uh, as you know, I've been on the podcast Business News Network radio show for about the last 28 episodes and stuff. But it's one of the things that I brought out, and I actually included on one blog as well on my website, that there's a big difference between a hypocritical play acting leader and a real leader.
Right,
And what you're describing there, people experience a degree of real. It's not all about me, as you correctly
right.
said. It's yeah, and so that's a key aspect of that for sure.
Well, cancer taught me, Randy, that it's a we disease. It's not an I disease.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when I came back to teaching, I brought some of that with me.
Interesting.
And
What
I
what
was,
what about the thinking changed that? And you have my compliments on that.
well, as a we person, you have to, as an I person, you kind of come into to train a pilot. You look at all different angles. Say, okay,
Hmm.
we'll beat this guy to get him to go where he needs to go.
Get them
And
through the squares.
yeah, yeah, it's like, do I have the square mallet? There's a square hole. Here he comes.
There you go.
But what I realized is, okay, by being a we person, we need to be more servant to our surroundings,
Hmm.
whether it's the student, whether it's the technician, whether it's the receptionist at the front desk or the
Yep.
building cleaner.
There you
And
go.
so, what I started realizing that I didn't do in the past is I would say to pilots and my colleagues, okay, so how did we get here? What led up to us being where we're here? And
Hmm.
how do we come out of the back end better? Not just that we filled a square and we passed, but are we going to grow out of this? And
Hmm.
so that changed the way that I do business and the way I practice, as a pilot, but also the way I practice my life now.
Yeah. Cool. Let me ask you this: Is how do you, in terms of techniques? And by the way, that's what you described is exactly the way I work with pilots as well. You have my compliments. But let me ask you something: with the techniques that you bring, what are some of the techniques that are different than what most other people bring to make that happen and make that a positive
Well, a
experience
lot of
and
the,
reaction?
a lot, it's funny you say that because aviation as a whole has changed.
Yep.
The pandemic in the last 3 years has changed the complexion of aviation.
Yep.
20 years ago, when I first got rated in the jet that my first jet type,
Yeah.
I was very inexperienced
Hmm.
compared to my colleagues that had twice my experience that went through that very same program.
Yeah.
So did I work hard? Yes, but I wasn't. I didn't work smart,
Yeah.
and so I realized you got to work smart, not hard.
Hmm.
Why make things difficult when you take a path of least resistance, get there quicker, and get it done? And
Yeah, and
so
it's interesting that with both of our backgrounds in aviation, when somebody takes off, guess what? There's going to be that one unexpected factor that could come on that flight that they would have never predicted.
it's ironic you say that. As a tenure instructor in a large global training organization,
Hmm.
I trained a pilot,
Hmm.
and I had just came back from being checked out in another airplane. So I brought some techniques with me from that organization.
Hmm.
And sure enough, his first flight out of the door after he left me, he had a rapid decompression in an airplane. He was flying with the outer windshield failed. And
Hmm.
he called me. He said, Jim, everything you told me in the sequence you told me to do it, I did it. And
Yeah.
so I firmly believe when you get training opportunities to grow, whether it's training, whether it's leadership, you have to look at those opportunities and say, okay, I'm going to go back to the job I was just in, doing the same thing. But what can I bring back from that experience that I just went to make this work opportunity better? Not
Hmm.
only just for the people that I train, but the people I work with, the people I support. And I think American business, international business as a whole, the smarter corporations are the ones that when they continue their employees' education and opportunities, come back and say, okay, what did you learn in that course that we could make things
Hmm.
better? And I think that the corporations in the 21st century that are going to thrive are the ones that strive for innovation. They
Hmm.
don't strive for their program being status quo because that's the way they've done it for 20 years. They look and say, okay, things are changing. And as you're aware, aviation as a profession is changing.
Yep.
Skill sets and the experience of pilots that we saw 15, 20 years ago is
Hmm.
totally different now than the pilots that are coming in. There are
Yeah.
pilots training in airplanes now that years ago wouldn't have even been allowed to stand on the stairway, much less
Yeah.
be part of the program.
Yeah.
So we as a profession, we have to change how we build that person. And
Mhm.
I'm a firm believer in building, not breaking.
So let me ask you this: what are some ways that, as an instructor, and this will be applicable to leaders leading their teams and developing their teams as well, but when you're working with a pilot, what are some ways that you adapt to maybe a different technique or something that would make that work for you?
I look at their skill set,
Hmm.
I look at their experience level, and instead of holding them to this standard when they're really here, I try to work to bring the standards together
Hmm.
to a merge point, and then taking that merge point and saying, okay, so we're at a merge point and we're accomplishing something.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it all then goes back to the we theory. I look at
Yeah.
that and say, you're not flying this airplane by yourself. Your partner's in the other seat with him.
Hmm.
And so I firmly am committed that we engage each other. And I like to use my when I'm with pilots in a simulator. I like to use the tripod theory of leadership.
Go
It's
ahead.
three of us that make this thing happen.
Hmm.
And so I'm one of the things of crew resource management is being professional enough. It used to be 30 years ago, the saying was being adult enough, but now it's being professional enough to say, okay, he's got a better idea than mine. I need to abandon mine and adopt his.
Hmm.
And
Or
ironically, when I was learning to fly the Airbus,
uh
fly by wire airplane with a side stick.
yeah, yeah,
And unlike conventional airplanes, it's totally backwards.
yeah.
So I was really struggling with. Well, my partner, Tricky Dick Wagell, uh,
Okay.
28-year career Air National Guard F-16 pilot's a Jim.
Well, he has my
Make,
compliments.
yeah, exactly. Make a small change, let it go. Make a small change, let it go.
Hmm.
And so I figured that out. It's like after like 2 sessions, the light came on, and I started getting a better feel for it. So you have to kind of, when you work with today's pilots, you have to kind of employ that deal. And sometimes there's different spectrums of employment of how you help a pilot get to where he needs to be.
And you know what you know what the struggle with that, the real challenging point of that is, and I kind of do this when I'm mentoring new instructors, is that every individual is a little different with
Yes.
their background, and you can't just go with the rote academic superficial stuff anymore. You got to know how to really connect and lead and mentor.
It's funny you say that. Working for a global training provider,
Uh-huh.
had a very interesting conversation with a retired Air Force colonel.
Go for it. Yeah.
And we had pilots that were struggling. And he says, well, wait a minute. They got a commercial license. They got this. They got this. They got this. I says, au contraire. I says, I'm going to put myself in your shoes. As an Air Force pilot, you're used to dealing with graduates from a known training process.
Hmm.
We can take all 4 Air Force pilot training bases and look at the pilots and take them one at a time and say, go do this. And they all do it the same.
Hmm.
And when you look at what the Air Force calls replacement training units, where pilots go to get specialty training in an airplane,
Yeah.
those pilots all come the same way.
Yeah.
So if you take the F-16 and you take a pilot from every Air Force base that flies F-16s and you put them in a room, and one at a time you put them in the simulator, do this, do this, do this, they all do it the same.
Yeah.
Now, aviation in the civil sector being a spectrum-driven organization,
Hmm.
you have pilots that fly I like to call mom and pop aviation,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
small airport at Maybury RFD that's uncontrolled.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, you got
We've
Elmer
all
who
we've all been there for
yeah,
sure.
you got Elmer who's the grass who's the chief pilot, chief mechanic, lawn technician,
Yep.
Aunt B who runs the books.
Hmm.
And so he comes out of there and he goes to an examiner, and they all may be good old boys, and they say, okay, well we know what he's looking for. And then you've got some other mom and pop aviation schools where you've got retired professional pilots that really like what they do, and
Yeah.
so we produce a different product. And then the far spectrum is we look at our aviation universities, we look at our ab initio programs that
Hmm.
are very solid. And if we look at our European counterparts in the EASA world, and soon to be the British CAA,
Yeah.
their direction of training is different. So now you throw all of these people from all walks of life in a pot.
Yeah.
And so you have a totally different spectrum of pilot to deal with, and a totally different spectrum of how you're going to get your point across.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting too, because one of the things that I do when I mentor instructors, particularly, you have different cultures around the world. Some are
Right,
much more high power distant cultures than others. And
right.
if you got somebody that's coming in as a high powered, it's very aligned with what you're saying. What I've told people is sometimes that much of a change is revolutionary in that pilot. And you know
Exactly.
what? You got to kind of, kind of link it and join where they are and how you get them to where they're going.
It's funny you say that. I was training a pilot to land an airplane one day,
Uh huh.
and had a very, very experienced instructor in the right seat.
Hmm.
And this pilot was from the Canary Islands,
Uh huh.
and so very proper, very British. And so my partner, using normal, correct aviation terminologies and aviation slang that we in the Western world would use,
Yeah.
we're using a precision approach path indicator light.
Yeah.
And he says, "I got two red balls," and the pilot was just couldn't rationalize it.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
stepped back, and said, "Wait a minute, okay, here's what happened." His name was Pierre. I said, "Pierre, you became a victim of what I call American aviation slang."
Hmm.
And in American in aviation slang, if I hear two red balls on a pappy, I know that I'm on the path.
Yeah.
If I hear four red balls, I know I'm below the path. If I hear
Yep. Yep.
four white balls, I'm above it. So he
Yep.
said two red balls, but didn't bother to tell you two reds, two whites. So your thinking went the opposite direction because he used some aviation slang.
Yeah. Yeah. And I tell you what, all of that is really a key aspect when you're talking about this. And as I think you already know, Jim, this is all applicable to just leading teams that are not in aviation.
Exactly.
You
And
know?
it's ironic you say that because when I talk with client account representatives
Uh-huh.
and schedulers and salespeople
Yeah.
about pilots' performance, I realize I have to change the way I present it. It's
Hmm.
one thing that I walk into a program manager's office or a lead or a lead instructor's office or standards guy
Yeah.
and talk aviation.
Hmm.
Uh, That's where your innovativeness has to come in
Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
have to say, okay, I have to change my message for the audience that I'm dealing with so that we all pull together versus being adversely chopped.
Yeah.
And you and I participated in the Global Aviation Organization once in our careers where there
Hmm.
was huge brick walls between organizations.
Yeah.
And getting through that wall was absolutely impenetrable, just next to impossible.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, a lot of us, and in fact, you were part of the wave, we kind of on our own got to know these people.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so when we went in there to say, okay, Jim Bloomberg, Randy Swaim's walking in here and they're going to say this, 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 and this. Okay, I get this.
Yeah.
And so that's part of it. That's part of leadership from a standpoint when you're dealing with your partners and other facets of your organization that may not be doing what you do, but
Yeah.
support what you do. By the same token, you support what they do. So
Hmm.
you have to tailor the message that you're delivering to them.
And align it with kind of where they are and in their journey for sure.
Right.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'll tell you what, those are really cool. I know we're getting a little bit close on time here, but let me just ask you this, Jim. Um, uh, as we sort of wrap up here in a minute or so, what's in your view, what's the one key takeaway you want to pass on to people that hear this interview?
My take is this: it's important to it's important to not remain in a status quo.
Hmm.
It's important to continually grow yourself, continue to build yourself.
Hmm.
Whether you're happy with your job and you want to stay in that job and retire, whether you want to move on and do other things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and in the process of that, you have to be innovative enough to say, okay, we're doing great, but how can we do better
Hmm.
with the people we're working with the people we're supporting, the people we uh, commingle with in our day to day work, and then the
Hmm.
people that we work in the same office with. And so
Hmm.
to do that, you have to be innovative. You
Yeah,
have to
you
look
do.
at other organizations. You say, okay, what are they doing that's different than what are we doing? Can we make our organization better?
Hmm. Cool. Well, I tell you what, that is awesome, and I think that's a very valuable insight for passing on to people, and it's why coaches are doing what they're doing, kind of thing. And you have my compliments. Well, I know we're kind of about to run out of time here, Jim. Just wanted to kind of mention to you that I know known each other for about 30 years now. It's been an honor to have you as a friend and also as a colleague for about the last 20 years. Look forward to chatting again.
Absolutely, Randy. This is a privilege to be here, and I'm glad that you took the time to invite me.
Sounds good, Jim. Well, listen, let you go. You have an awesome afternoon, and we'll look forward to talking to you next time.
Thank you, sir. You too.
Take care now. Bye bye.